Welcome to the KIPS podcast. My name is Tyler Valencia. I'm the president of KIPS and Time to Train Fitness. I have a guest and a topic that I'm very interested in learning more about it. Just a little background information and how this episode came together. Our guest, Jenn, and I met through a fitness conference. And when we were talking about doing another episode, she asked, would the topic of grief and loss be suitable for your audience? And from our experiences with the KIPS podcast, I mean, just a few episodes ago, we talked about trauma, and wow, that episode really was rich in content. And I thought, wow, another great episode to provide for our audience, get information out there that I'm sure many people listening, they might be wondering, where do I start? How do I even approach this topic? So Jenn, first, thanks for coming on the podcast again. And I'm excited for today's episode.
Thanks so much, Tyler. It's always great to get together and chat and share all kinds of things that we've learned along the way.
Yes. Well, Jenn, for the listeners, a little refresher for everybody out there. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself, background, and kind of what you're doing now?
Absolutely. So I come to you via being a yoga teacher originally, and I came to yoga weirdly. I was a runner back in the day, well, a little bit still now, but really training hard, running marathons and things like that. And one of my friends kept saying, Jenn, you got to go to yoga. You got to go to yoga. And finally, one day I show up for class. She didn't. But anyway, I show up for class and I tell you what, the very first pose of the class, I thought, oh, this is where I'm supposed to be. Mm-hmm. And I loved it from the first moment and started taking class almost every single day. It helped out my running tremendously. It helped settle me down and help my body become strong in ways I didn't realize. It helped me, of course, gain flexibility and range of motion, and that was great too. And I was hooked right away and almost immediately started looking for ways to share that with other people. And so I enrolled in a yoga teacher training and started getting really curious and became a yoga teacher a little while later. And that kind of started the ball rolling. And then as I began applying yoga more and more in just the studio or at the gym or wherever, I found that people were wanting to know if yoga could do more. Mm-hmm. Can yoga help me with my anxiety? Can yoga help me recover from knee surgery? Can yoga help me with all of these different things? And I found myself doing lots of outside research. Yeah. And then the opportunity to become a certified yoga therapist came up, and I was all over it immediately. I immediately started taking these classes to teach me how to apply yoga therapeutically. I started sharing that with my students, with my friends, with my family, with myself, and really bringing all of those things together and realize that this was really kind of my life's calling, I believe. Mm-hmm. I just keep getting deeper and deeper and taking on new topics and ways to apply it. And it's really been very rewarding.
Yeah. And to build off of that, I will say that for the longest time, I actually had I'll admit it, that I had a negative outlook on yoga. I had a bad experience probably 15 years ago. And, those things happen with any type of exercise format. And it really turned me off to it. But over the last few years and understanding the importance of recovery and what that can do for your body and flexibility, working on those items. And I think the point that I'm trying to make here is there's so many different ways that instructors can teach flexibility and their approach to it, that if you look for it, you can find anything out there that will apply to you, that you'll be like, oh, wow, this person speaks to me in a certain way that I like it. It's digestible to me. I think oftentimes people think that, yoga or somebody that's in the yoga realm, that there's a certain stereotype. I don't like using that word with it, but there's a certain stereotype with it. But I've been seeing so many different applications of it over the last few years. And I think social media has helped that. things like YouTube has helped it. Online
Definitely.
workouts has helped it. And I think that that's such a positive thing that, I mean, someone like myself that's very active, that does multiple activities, I thoroughly enjoy what it does for my life. So I think that's great that you shared how, I mean, your background with it, how you came to it now, and how even your approach to it. I think that that's something different than what many people might think. But let's now kind of switch gears here and talking with the main topic of grief and loss. So you just came out with a new course with YogaFit on this. Can you first just give some background of it? Tell us about the course, of course, where they can find it, and some details.
Absolutely. So the course is called Yoga for Grief and Loss. We don't leave too much to the imagination, pretty straightforward there. It is offered through YogaFit, which you can find at yogafit.com, and just search for grief and loss and you'll be able to find it there. And I'm very excited about it. Grief and loss sort of fell into my lap as a topic. It's not, I mean, nobody wants to study grief and loss, right?
Yeah.
But a few years ago, a fellow yoga teacher was scheduled to lead a workshop on grief and loss, and she was going to lead it with a partner yoga teacher. And as things go, her partner yoga teacher's sister passed away just a few days before the workshop. And so just, of course, devastating loss, but the workshop was full and the people who signed up for it needed it. And she asked me if I would be willing to step in. And I actually had a little bit of time to devote to, kind of researching, getting in there with her, figuring out what they had planned and how are we going to deliver this together. And we were able to do it, and it went really, really well. And I found myself inspired by applying yoga to grief, which I had not done before. And from there, it just kept rolling down the hill. I kept, I advertised that workshop, and someone else wanted to know if I could teach it for them. Could I teach it online? Could I teach it at this studio? And it just kept going and going. And finally, the opportunity came for me to be able to write the course. And I felt equipped to be able to do so now, with lots of experience working with individuals who are walking a journey that we all share, and yet we all experience uniquely.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of how we got there. And the course launched earlier this year in January. And we've been offering it about every other month since then, and really meeting people in the middle of an extremely difficult time, as well as, facilitating yoga teachers being able to gain these skills so that they can do the same in their own community.
The first thing that kind of came to my mind that I'd love to hear your perspective on this, and it's probably a different approach to it. So, I mean, when people are experiencing grief or some type of trauma, maybe they're trying to keep their mind off of it, and they might think, oh, something quiet, calm, like yoga, I'm just going to be thinking about it. My mind's going to be racing. How do you approach that conversation with somebody that maybe that's what they think? They think that I don't want to be with my thoughts. What is that? Is that a pretty common occurrence that happens?
It definitely can be. And the approach that we take in the course is very active. So it is not, necessarily beautiful ambient music, sitting in lotus pose with a beautiful hand mudra and all of your troubles float away. Like, that's not real life.
Yeah.
Real life is in the middle of grief. Maybe you're angry, you're sad, you're depressed, you're confused. Like, all of these different things can come up. And so rather than trying to pretend like they're not there, or trying to escape from that and come to this place where there's no trouble in the yoga room, instead we meet it head on, and we're like, what's going on in there? Okay, well, let's express that with our body. And so we have adapted some yoga poses to be extremely expressive of the emotion. And I tell you what, Tyler, it can really get going in a yoga for grief class. Like, we have some, some yelling out, not free form yelling out, but in cooperation with the pose, or some big breaths where we can sigh out the frustration, the sadness, whatever's coming our way. And we will take our journey through the different experiences grief brings our way and be able to express really a large majority of them.
A quick little promo break here in this episode. If you're a fan of the KIPS podcast, you know that at some point there's a promotion for the Naboso Duo insoles. I just pulled these out of my shoes, gave them a quick rinse to get the sock dust off of them, and I wanted to talk about them because they're great. They're fantastic. They make an impact on your daily life. If you sit at a desk or if you're on your feet, sometimes your feet just feel achy, or maybe they feel like they went to sleep. That's for myself. I felt like after working a full day that my feet did not want to go to the gym, work out, do something active, and it led to some bad habits. But with these, I feel more active. I feel I can do more things, and I've been using them for over a year now. With your clients, with your family, with your friends, share them, talk about them, see what they think, because they really do make a difference. If your feet feel more active, you're gonna be more active, and that equates to being more healthy. Check them out. There's a link in the description. See all the products they have, and let's get back to this episode.
That's great. That's great to hear. With the research of it now, I know that was one of the things that I'm sure myself and other audience members are interested in. How do you go about researching a topic like this, and ways that you went with to essentially writing this manual?
Yeah. Well, I took a pretty multifaceted approach. I wanted to try to not leave many stones unturned. And so I started with the most basic, simple thing, like defining what grief is, what constitutes a loss. So I looked at just basic definitions. And then from there, looked at some of the nuts and bolts, if you will, of what grief and loss do. How do grief and loss affect our mind? How do grief and loss affect our body? What are the physical expressions, the mental expressions, the emotional expressions that happen when we're experiencing this loss and the subsequent grief? And then I took a little bit of not a diversion, but really just looking at it through another lens. Okay, now we have statistics. We understand what those are. And in fact, if you have a group of people, approximately 60% of them will have experienced a loss within the last 3 years. And so it's pretty a high percentage of people that we meet, in some instances, even up to 85%. You know, obviously different studies catch different groups of people, but easily we could say more than half of the people that we encounter in our life are dealing with a notable loss within the last 3 years. But then to take another look at it and begin to look at it through the Ayurvedic lens. And for those who are unfamiliar, Ayurveda is the sister science to yoga, and is the way we understand things like body types and seasons and imbalance in the body, even how illness and disease develop. And we look at how Ayurveda looks at grief. And it's super interesting because when we look at it through an Ayurvedic lens, as far as our body types go, not to get too deep, but we have an airy body type, a fiery body type, and an earthy body type. And we find that grief expresses itself in those same three ways. We have airy expressions of grief, which look like anxiety and forgetfulness and spaciness. We have fiery expressions of grief, which look like being really angry or maybe very driven to make a difference as a result of what's happened. And we have an earthy expression of grief, and that's more like our depression, sadness, those things that feel heavier. And so we unpack that pretty well as far as understanding how grief manifests itself from that Ayurvedic view, and then how to support it. And then the final piece is really that philosophical piece. And we look at the different yoga texts there. We look at the Four Noble Truths. We look at the Yoga Sutras, which are basically a group of small, simple truths that are all woven together. And then we also considered the story of the Bhagavad Gita, which is super fun to say. And if you're unfamiliar with that story, it's essentially Avatar. The people in the story are even blue. So, but it's the same sort of hero's journey type of story. And we look at these wisdom texts from ancient times and look at how they understand loss and grief and how to move forward from there. And so we really cast a pretty wide net to get as much understanding as possible. And that way we have a really good background of our information, of different aspects to look at as we then begin to apply yoga.
Wow. Very fascinating and informative. I mean, I'll say honestly that 95% of that I am very new to. And yet this is how you started off saying how I believe you said 60% of people have experienced loss or grief in the last year. Yeah. And I mean, that's such a high occurrence that as a health, wellness, fitness professional, you're going to come across individuals like this. And so it's something that I'm sure every instructor out there, no matter what your profession is, you're wondering, what is that conversation like? Is there any way that I can help them? And items like this, courses like this that provide training and insight into it, I think is such a great tool to have as an instructor. So what were some of your favorite parts with the research of it that you uncovered and you thought, oh, wow, that's very unique. That's something that I never thought of, or maybe you thought of, wow, this can really help other instructors with this process?
I really think that the Ayurvedic piece was probably the most meaningful to me, being able to look at it and say, oh, that's an airy expression. That's a fiery expression. That's an earthy expression. It sort of demystified the experience of grief for me, because growing up, I didn't know what to say to people or, any of those sort of things. I would feel very awkward, very uncomfortable. And I think a lot of us share that uncertainty of how to talk to someone who's experienced a loss or how to understand what they're going through. We just hope and pray it doesn't happen to us, even though we know full well it is going to at some time. Yeah. And we just, we feel ill-equipped, to say the least. And so to be able to demystify it and say, oh, okay, so basically anxiety, anger, depression, and the things that are associated with those three major experiences. And then, okay, well, then that's easy. If I'm feeling airy and spacey, then I need to do some grounding yoga practice. And you could really apply this to any of the exercise disciplines, right? So more floor postures, more deep stretch work. We're going to bring ourselves down when we feel really anxious. When we're feeling super fired up, the idea may be, oh, we need to cool that down. And we do, because we don't want to be raging on people. But sometimes before we can do that, that anger needs a place to be expressed, because it's not socially acceptable to express a lot of anger in the middle of our grieving. We feel like we're limited to only sadness, right? So to be able to express it. So maybe that means we do a super hard workout, some big weights if we're doing weight training, big demanding yoga postures if we're doing yoga postures, maybe a quicker tempo or a higher rate of intensity, or even a warm room, to allow all of that heat to get out, so that we've created room for the coolness to soften the edge of the fire, if you will. And then whenever we have that earthy, heavy depression, was just the opposite of anxiety, right? Instead of grounding that down, we actually need to see if we can energize it and lift it up. And so we may start laying down. I've even started with students and clients online in this format, and they turn on the camera and they are in bed. And so we may start with the, like they got their comfortable yoga clothes on and they're ready, but they laid back down because they were exhausted. So we start off the movements with them laying wherever they are. I've had students take the class on their couch or whatever. So we may start off that way with floor work. And then as the body gets moving, as the breath starts to flow, then we can lift it up and start to fill the body with air, lighten up the mood. We may incorporate things like, back bends that help to open up the front of the body and energize us, and really bring about lifting of what feels so heavy. So it takes away a lot of the guesswork. We have someone in front of us, I don't know what to do, but we can recognize if they're anxious, angry, or sad.
Yeah.
And then from there, help them to bring a little bit more balance. It's certainly not going to fix anything, right? It's not going to take away their grief. But I figure if people walk out of the time together and their experience feels a little less heavy, less sad, less anxious, less angry, a little bit of a little bit more ease into how they're feeling, then I think that's a really successful session together.
Yeah, very informative there. And I like how you mentioned other disciplines of health and fitness and the application of it. I think I'm sure many professionals would love to learn more in that area, because as we're talking about, we're going to come across anybody or somebody in our work and our career that's going through that. And just how you said, the conversation is tough. You don't know what to say, but being able to know this information and then apply it right there, and basically trying to, I don't want to say read your client, but try to guess where they're at and then formulate a plan right there. I mean, very informative and something that they can utilize on a weekly basis. So very informative there. Next piece here that kind of came to my mind with the communication part of it. I think that we're talking about that now with somebody that's going through loss and grief, and maybe it's that first initial part. Have you found that maybe somebody or a potential client that's going through grief or loss, are they typically the one that maybe they reach out, or maybe it's an existing client? What have you kind of seen?
It really comes up in a lot of different ways. Yeah. If it's someone I'm working with personally as a private client, then they usually tell me. A lot of times it means they've had to call or text or email and cancel a session. I have to cancel today. I have had a loss in the family, or, whatever it is. So very often I'll know in that way. Other times when it's a student in a class, it may be harder to know, right? You may or may not know about students in a fitness class or yoga class, why they're gone. There's 20 of them. I don't know why everyone who usually comes isn't here. So then it depends on them saying something. Yeah. Now, maybe they missed a couple of weeks and they never miss class. Well, then it would be very natural, right? We probably ask, hey, I missed you the last couple of weeks. Everything okay? Well, no. Actually. And then they tell what happened. And then at that point, I usually simply ask, would you like to talk more about that? Because they may not. It may be all they can do to hold it together. And if they breathe one more word, they're going to fall apart, and they don't want to fall apart. Yeah. But they may be very relieved to know that someone is listening and not afraid for them to say more about what happened. And so I just like to invite them, is there more? Would you like to talk about that a little bit more? Or would you like to, schedule a time where we could apply some yoga therapy and help alleviate some of the things you're experiencing? And from there, the answers are as different as each individual person.
Yeah, I bet.
Yeah.
Nice.
Other instances too is just to have a class. Like I do teach, it's usually limited. Typically I do 6 weeks yoga for grief and loss, and it starts and it goes through a progression and it ends. And over the course of that 6 weeks, we cover pretty much all of the major themes that we experience as we go through grief, and how to support those with yoga and breath and some journaling too, some things to write down as we experience. And that's a lovely way as well. Well, then for for sure everyone in there is there for a reason. And it could be a recent loss. I've had also people come who feel like they've never fully processed that something that happened 20 years ago.
Wow.
And they're realizing it's coming up and they're ready to do it now. So yeah, that can be a really powerful way as well to apply movement and to the grief process in a contained series.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Kind of the same lines here with shifting to the course. I mentioned for instructors now that they're going to go through this type of training. Do you find that there's a lot of sections in it that might be tough for instructors to personally go through, that they might think, oh man, this is tough, but it's going to be very informative? Are there sections in that challenge them? I feel like that's part of almost any courses. There's going to be some challenging aspects of it, but are there some of those in there?
Absolutely. Whenever as instructors, and it doesn't matter what we teach, right? Whenever we're learning the things, it's our work first, right? Even if we're talking about working on upper body strength. To learn how to teach upper body strength, we got to experience the pain of developing upper body strength. So that's definitely true. I often will have people come to the course who know that they're in the middle of experiencing this grief. And then I also have people who come thinking, oh, well, this sounded interesting to me because I know I have 3 students who lost a best friend or an aunt or whatever. I wanted to take this for them. And they get there and realize that there are some things that they maybe could process more or had left unfinished at some point. And I will say that there are usually tears during this course, but not as many as you might think. We do also share, all of the emotions. It lends itself to a wide range of expression and experience. And what I will say for sure is that even those who come to the course feeling apprehensive, nervous, like they're going to cry the whole time, they're not sure if they're going to be able to process, without fail, they leave feeling a little bit lighter.
Oh, I bet.
Yeah.
Well, with developing this course and doing the research for it and putting it all together, what were some of your favorite parts of the development, like the writing or the research? What were your favorite parts?
I love writing. It's one of my favorite things to do. What I did was I took a format for it's a 2-day training. I took a format for a 2-day training that I specifically enjoyed, the progression of it, how it went through the research and the, looking at all of those different perspectives and then the application. And I created a map out of that course. And then I applied this subject matter to it. And I tried to make it as relatable as possible. I wanted people to be able to take this course with a level 1 understanding of yoga and not feel like they should have taken 200 more hours of training before they got here. I wanted people to really be able to come in and say, my yoga understanding is pretty basic, but I can apply these principles. So it's very accessible to learners of all types, regardless of whether you're there for personal, whether you're coming from another discipline, or whether you're a brand new yoga teacher or enthusiast. It really is my hope, and so far has been the feedback, that it is easy to implement, understand, and apply.
Yeah, I can share that from my experiences with making courses. The part that you mentioned, the writing, is, I'll say it's the hardest part for me. I enjoy the planning part of it. I mean, you got all the ideas flowing. You make your outline, and you're brainstorming all these pieces. And then once it comes to oh wow, I have to put all these together. It's one of the more challenging aspects, in my opinion, with But creating a course, there's so many pieces to it. The research, the writing, how it appears, images. So many things that people don't think. They just get a manual in front of them that they think, oh wow, okay. But there's so many hours that even not writing that go into, you're just brainstorming, trying to come up with more ideas. Were there any parts that were hard for you to write in this manual?
I really think the hardest part for me was wrestling with some of the yoga philosophy. It was difficult to apply some of those philosophical texts because they are philosophical, but they may or may not have been directly addressing grief. And to bring those things together was pretty challenging, but in the end, it ended up being one of my favorite parts. And I think it's kind of the same thing. I had to do my own deep philosophical work to be able to get it on the page. And so now it's probably one of my very favorite sections in the manual to go through and, kind of dive in there and see how this all works out.
Yeah. And I mean, what immediately popped into my mind there is when people want to debate different types of research and stuff along those nature, when it depends. Like that's really, once you start to study different disciplines and research, you start to understand it depends. And that's not the answer what people want. And so, I mean, just the way that even myself and how I viewed one of my favorite topics is core training. And I now say that I talk more about core training theory because it's less of the research and application, those types of items and performance. It's more of a theory in my mind. But exactly how you said, you're looking at a certain philosophy or different outlook on something, and you're trying to apply it to something. And I mean, some things overlap, some things don't. And I think that that's part of the beauty of science, because I'm sure that there was a investigative part on your own. As you're going through it, you're trying to see if it does relate. So kudos to you for putting it together in that way.
Well, thank you. It was certainly, my goodness, such an honor, really, to be able to bring the things together and share them with other people.
So we're going to get now to the podcast takeaway of the episode here. And while we were going through this, I was like, I feel like I want to switch it. And I've started to do that more with the question at the end. And so I apologize. Little background information on every episode. Everybody that comes on the podcast, they get an outline with some sample questions. I may ask them, I may not. And sometimes the guests, they prepare, they write notes out. So I apologize if you did write any notes for this one, for this last question. But with myths, and I'm going to switch it out instead of being online training, what are 3 myths about yoga and potentially yoga for grief that you found throughout your research and development of this course?
Well, I think a lot of the same yoga myths that apply to any yoga apply here. So often as I'm starting a course for grief and loss, someone will say, "Oh, I'd really love to do that, but I can't touch my toes." It's the same as yoga class. Being able to touch your toes is not a requirement. There is no level of physical fitness other than a willingness to show up. Everything else can be modified. We can choose different variations so that it fits for where you and your body are right now. So yoga for grief and loss, I always say, you don't have to put on your fancy tights. You don't need a high ponytail. Just come. And everything else we can figure out. It doesn't matter to me if you attend on your lunch hour, if you came home from work, if you are already in, your comfy clothes that you put on after you get home. None of that stuff matters. Another myth that comes up pretty often is that idea kind of, and you already alluded to it, that idea of, yoga is this sitting in, on a peaceful lily pad in the middle of a pond and nothing, and we're going to pretend like nothing's wrong. It's certainly not that. We definitely get in there and really experience our experience on the mat. And it is very freeing. It's very liberating. I find that people tend to leave with smiles on their faces more often than not because they've allowed their body to express what's going on in the mind and emotions. And that's what we're here for. So that would be the next one. And then the other one is almost the opposite of that. Some people are so worried to come because they're afraid they're going to cry through the whole thing. I don't want to come because I'm going to cry through the whole thing. Well, you might. And that's okay.
Yeah.
We have tissues. We're all here for yoga for grief. So no one at all is going to judge what's happening for you. We may be crying right along with you and maybe not. And so often people find that they do end up feeling much different by the end of the time together. So a little bit of like logistical concerns, and then the rest really falling in that just unknown about I don't know how I'm going to react and being nervous about that.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Great stuff. I think the one that I'll expand on a little bit, and it's more the first one with I don't have the capacity to touch my toes, or I'm not flexible already. I never understand that one with, do you think that you're supposed to be good at exercise right away? That you're supposed to know how to do certain movements and you're just going to get into them. And I think that as instructors, making sure that we share with potential clients that it doesn't matter where you're at. Exercise, whether it's yoga, strength training, whatever it is, can be for anybody, and anything can be modified for them. And probably, and I was about to say probably, but it will be safer for them if they do not do anything. I remember years ago, I think I read a statistic that people had a higher chance because they want to get in shape in order to exercise, and they end up hurting themselves and never
Right.
even getting on their journey. So those are things that all us health, wellness, fitness professionals will go through in our careers. And so great episode so far. Jenn, can you please share information on where they can find you, the course information, all that kind of good stuff?
Absolutely. You can find me on the socials. I'm on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, all the same, Jenn Tarrant Yoga. And that's JennTarrantYoga. And you can find me all three of those places. You can also find me at JennTarrant.com. And as far as the training goes, again, offered through YogaFit, and you can find that at YogaFit.com.
Great. Now, all those will be in the description for this podcast episode. Perfect. So you can make sure that get all that. If this interests you, explore it more, add it to your practice, another tool in your toolbox. Jenn, thank you for coming on the KIPS podcast, talking about a topic that I'm sure a lot of individuals were wondering, where do I even start with this? How do I apply it? Can it be useful for me? So thank you so much, as always.
Thank you again, Tyler. Great to be here.